Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hi, and welcome to the Ideas Roadshow podcast. I'm Howard Burton, your host and creator of Ideas Roadshow, and I'm delighted to be partnering with the New Books Network to offer you our uniquely eclectic blend of long-format conversations with a wide array of experts across many different subjects. The following discussion is a reformatted podcast version of one of Ideas Roadshow's first 100 film conversations that's available in print as both an individual ebook and as part of a 5-conversation collection in ebook and paperback. Visit ideasroadshow.com for more details. As anyone who's tried to do so can tell you, understanding a foreign culture can be a challenging experience. It's not just our ignorance of many of the particulars, or even that we're ignorant about what we're ignorant about, although both of those things are naturally formidable obstacles to getting an accurate picture of things. It's that we often unthinkingly try to impose our own familiar frameworks on other traditions when they don't actually fit. Like when I sat down to talk to Eleanor Nesbitt about the Sikh tradition and immediately asked her about Sikhism, whereupon she pointed out in her insightful yet ever so polite way that even asking that question points us in the wrong direction. So an obvious question to begin is how you became what you are today in terms of not only your scholarship but also your orientation and how you became an expert in Sikh studies and Hindu studies and all of that.
There are several answers. One is that I basically never left school. I carried on, but I've done what a theologian friend of mine once described as climbing up a tree, and when a branch branches out, then slithering along it, and then when a twig turns into a branch that will support me, then going out on that one, but not having a view at the beginning of necessarily which tree I was going to climb or where the branches were going to be or which ones I was going to go out on. So one thing has followed another. There's been quite a lot of intuition in it. I started off on the south coast of England, going to school in Bournemouth and being interested in the diversity around me. Looking back, I realised that I was particularly intrigued by the fact that some friends were Jewish and some people in the locality were Roma, were Romani, Gypsies, and some people were visiting French language students, and so on. And I also knew from very early on that I was going to study Latin and Greek. There was something about the rather academic secondary school that I went to that directed me that way, but also perhaps the knowledge that my father had been studying Greek during the months before I was born, I don't know. There was also, increasingly when I got to university, a sense that I was going to go to India. It was never a decision that I remember taking. It was more, yes, the next thing I'm going to do is go to India. And one can find all sorts of reasons for going to India in 1974. In my family life, my great-great-grandmother was known to have gone to India and come back safely. There were people going out as hippies. There was a general idea that people on a spiritual search went to India. I suppose people could analyse that in different ways, and looking back, I just know that overwhelmingly I had a sense of being directed that this is where I was going to go, even though my tutor, for example, at Oxford, where I was doing my teaching course, strongly advised everyone against going overseas and strongly advised them to take a job because jobs were becoming more difficult to find. And one of the things that I've advised students when they've come to me for advice is if you haven't got any dependents who need to be considered, then follow your hunches and do not follow what your tutor says to you. That leaves them with a dilemma.
Indeed. Indeed. How many of them recognize that it leaves them with a dilemma and say, therefore, I'm not going to listen to a word that you've done?
Nobody has said that. I sometimes explain it to them.
I'd like to back up a little bit. You said something curious about your father studying Latin in the weeks before you were born. So
He was studying, it was New Testament Greek.
Oh, I thought you said Latin. I'm sorry.
It was New Testament Greek because he was very embedded in the Church of England and was a lay reader. And actually, during my time as an undergraduate at Cambridge, he was ordained as a priest. And I had never been able to understand what it was to be a member of the Church of England. I only remember feeling uncomfortable and out of place and questioning about it. And so it was a crunch when he was ordained and I was in this wonderful space in Cambridge where I could explore all sorts of religions and philosophies and try and find out, who I was at the age of 18 or 19 or whatever. And there was my father being ordained as a priest in the Church of England. And I couldn't even say the creed.
How did you feel about that?
I don't suppose he knew that I couldn't say the creed. Oh. I wasn't quite as open as George Eliot was. I come from Coventry at the moment, and our most noted writer, certainly our most noted novelist, is George Eliot. And when I take people to Holy Trinity Church, I show them the plaque that commemorates the fact that her father, Robert Evans, was a sidesman there. And then I tell them about the letter that she wrote to her father, because she couldn't bear to tell him face to face, explaining that she could no longer with integrity worship in the church with him because she no longer believed in the inerrancy of Scripture. And that dilemma that she outlines in the letter is just so much the dilemma that I had right the way through my teens and into my 20s. Mm.
And was this, from your perspective, was this a sudden decision on the part of your father to become a priest in the Church of England, or was this something that he had been constantly moving towards, as it were, throughout your youth?
His church life had been central, basic to his existence, right from his own boyhood, and certainly all the way through my childhood, I knew the importance of it, and it was simply that, for various reasons, he was a telephone engineer. He was working in telecommunications. And it was only when he was able to envisage retiring from that he could take on the responsibilities of more in-depth theological training and eventually ordination.
I see. So previously, in a previous interview that you had, you talked about how you were, my words, not yours, determined to go to Cambridge. This had been a dream or destiny or some combination thereof. I'm not sure exactly. Again, these are my words, and perhaps not appropriate. But this was something that you had become fairly resolute towards, the notion of going to Cambridge to study as an undergraduate. You enrolled in a classics program, and yet at the same time, you, at some level, if memory serves, were oriented even then towards Oriental studies or Asian studies or whatever the equivalent would be today. So I was confused when I saw this, because I thought, what would have motivated you to be moving in that direction even before you had such a direct experience with the Asian world?
Do you want me to go back to going to Cambridge and so on, or just to answer that?
Answer the question.
Because it's a very difficult one to answer. Maybe at the time I had some awareness, but looking back, I have no idea why I put Oriental Studies on my form. And the fact that when I got to interview at Girton College in Cambridge, I had no idea which Oriental study I was thinking of, rather suggests that it was just one of those things that came from deep inside me somewhere but hadn't been worked out in my head.
So how did that go exactly? You're there at the interview, and then the person says, I see you put down Oriental Studies. What is it about Oriental Studies that interests you? And you say, I have no idea.
The senior tutor who interviewed me actually had an interest in Egyptology. So she steered the conversation by showing me some statuette or something which she had in her room, and exploring a bit of that with me, because I think Egyptology must have been covered by Oriental Studies at Cambridge.
So she had wanted to subsume you in her orbit, as it were.
She was actually a classicist, but she was trying to find out, I think. And it was not unknown for people to arrive with their credentials in Latin and Greek and then start studying Turkish and Arabic, like one of my friends did, or some other language. So although I might have appeared clueless, it was also regarded as, perfectly natural to start from scratch in some new language.
Right. So you progressed along, and I think there was also a French component. Was there, that you had French in history, or am I confusing?
Oh, it was simply that whilst I was studying in Cambridge, I came to know that I was going to head off to India, and I knew that the only way I could sort of support myself for a significant length of time and be reasonably useful was as a teacher. And so I did my postgraduate certificate in education in the Department of Educational Studies in Oxford, and with a view to the future, I thought, okay, I've been studying Latin and Greek and then theology, but what about my A-level French? I enjoy French. It would be good to do have some training in French as well as religious education. So that's what I did.
I see. So it was a practical, tactical, and also personal interest as well.
Yes.
So at what point along the road, as you're in Cambridge and you're in a classics program, nominally registered in Oriental Studies, did you decide, I'm going to go to India?
I wasn't registered in Oriental Studies. I'd put that on an application form, but I was registered in classical studies because I quickly realised that it was much better to start off with languages that I'd already got a grounding in, rather than to be starting in something else. And I moved into theology with the feeling, well, this is the Middle East, and it also helps me to explain to myself perhaps how my father's spiritual and intellectual journey had gone. So what was the question? At
what point did you think, so you're pointed towards the Middle East and then you go a further ways to the east. So at what point did you say, or start thinking, without necessarily revealing to anyone else or say anything in a committed way, I'm going to go to India?
It must have been my second year, maybe possibly my third year in Cambridge. There would have been conversations with friends who had been to India or were going to India, and also I do distinctly remember that there was a program of TEEP lectures whereby a theologian from Cambridge would go to New Delhi, I think it was always New Delhi, and a theologian from India would come to Cambridge in alternate years. And I remember Paul Sudhakar coming from South India to give the TEEP lecture in Cambridge, and I don't remember what he talked about, but I remember having a very strong sense then that I was going to go off to India.
And right before we move to your Indian experiences, what were the reactions of your parents? What did your father have to say about this?
I don't remember any reactions. My father would tend to go very quiet if there was something difficult, and my mother had been pretty petrified of my going to France, I remember, when I was a teenager. But the fact that this great-great-grandmother had come back safely from India, I think, was very reassuring to her.
Was that on your mother's side or your father's side? Oh,
yeah.
Okay.
So, and that great-great-grandmother must have gone in the first half of the 19th century. So I don't remember any reaction. Isn't that odd? And I remember saying goodbye to them. I said, no, don't come to the airport. So I just said goodbye to them at home and went off to the station and caught the train. And I remember somebody on the train saying, where are you going today? And I said, I'm going to India.
And when you left, for a 3-year stint to be teaching at a school. Is that correct?
Well, I taught in the school from September 1974 through to It would have been November 1976, so it was 2 academic years. And I was travelling each winter that I was there. I didn't come home until March 77. And the period almost exactly coincided with what's known as the emergency, which was the period during which Mrs. Indira Gandhi had direct rule over India, and various dissidents went off to jail.
So I'd like to come back to that, but before I do, here's where I've pegged your history, as it were. As an undergraduate in Cambridge, you've been inspired by various different factors, lectures, friends, all the rest. Your parents are not throwing up major roadblocks to prohibit you from going overseas due to quietude which befalls your father, due to a great-grandmother who's returned on your mother's side.
Great-grandmother.
Great-great-grandmother. But what's less clear is the mechanism by which you've gone there in terms of the arrangements you've made to be teaching and all that, because you're not just backpacking through India as people do today.
No. Well, part of the story is that I griped in the hearing of a professor of theology, professor of divinity, that men seemed to get scholarships and bursaries to go off to Israel and women didn't seem to be quite so fortunate. And very soon after that, I had an award to go to Jerusalem to study in St. George's College. So that was the summer of 1973. I was already intending to go to India the year after, and had actually, I think, submitted an application to a school in the Himalayan foothills. And in Jerusalem, I met Mary and Murray Rogers. They had, before living in the old city of Jerusalem, they had lived in India and had a Christian ashram. And Mary Rogers had also been a very talented contemporary of my senior tutor when they were both classics undergraduates at Girton. And I said to them, I'm going to India and I'm intending to teach. And do you know anybody who might want me to go? And they said, well, we know 2 schools and 2 head teachers. Why don't you contact them? And one was in Delhi and one was in Nainital. At that time, it was part of Uttar Pradesh. The state of Uttar Pradesh has been subdivided since. And so I simply wrote to the 2 head teachers, and one of them wanted me and one of them didn't. So it was very simple.
That's interesting, and also, as we'll see, quite serendipitous in terms of at least your awareness of Sikhism and so forth, because that puts you in the right part of the world to get a deeper understanding.
You see how the branches grow and the twigs come out. I went to Cambridge because of having fallen in love with the ducks and the willow trees when I was 8, and having vowed to go back 10 years later. I went to Nainital because of this connection of my senior tutor's old contemporary. And in Nainital, although it was not in Punjab, it happened that probably nearly 50% of my students in the girls' school there were Sikhs. And I knew nothing about Sikhism. They were Sikhs because in 1947, India had gained independence at the cost of partition, which meant that Sikhs and Hindus on what was now the Pakistan side of the border had, as far as possible, migrated into India. And many of those Sikhs had been compensated with land, but it was not cultivated land, it was jungle in the foothills of the Himalayas. And by the time I went out in 74, they'd converted it into wheat farms, sugarcane farms, and so on. And they needed their daughters to be able to marry suitably. and what was called a convent education was something that they needed.
I see.
So here were there were a lot of Hindus in the school as well. It was roughly half and half Hindu and Sikh, and just a scattering of Buddhists because of Tibetan refugees, and Christians generally related to members of the teaching staff, and one or two Muslims. And of course I did know a bit about the Hindu tradition, even though at Cambridge my religious studies had only taken me into Christianity, Judaism and Islam. What I didn't know about was the Sikh tradition.
And did you do much extra preparation on your own in terms of Hinduism before you went? Did you read widely and avidly before you left, or did you just...
No, I read nothing at all. I would, while I was a student, because I was interested, I'd, for example, read the Bhagavad Gita, but that was on the recommendation of a student from India who'd, I think he'd quoted from it in a speech in the Cambridge Union. I didn't do any preparation for going to the school, as far as I remember. I asked the head teacher what I should do, and she said, well, read Jim Corbett. And Jim Corbett was somebody who was a tiger hunter who had later on transferred to photographing animals rather than killing them. And his activities were in the area of Nainital. And so just about all I knew about my new surroundings when I went out was that I think the finger of a girl who'd been eaten by a man-eating tiger had been thrown in the lake near the school where I was about to teach. And I had some sort of sense of the forestry because the head had asked me to look at a book on the forest. And it certainly wasn't of any concern to people who were running a diocesan school that any teacher should know anything about Hindu or Sikh background. These were girls who were being educated in a Christian school, a Church of North India school. They were all singing hymns and doing all the things you do in a school like that. So their background, I think, was of very little interest to the people who employed me. And one of the things I was doing, apart from teaching English, was teaching religious education. And I wanted to make it much wider than just sort of straightforward Christian instruction. So it was all quite challenging to me, especially the experience of being in the chapel and being amongst all these Hindus and Sikhs who were energetically singing things like the heathen in his blindness.
Did it prove controversial with the authorities of the school that you personally were motivated by a wider mandate to...
No, I don't think so, because I wasn't particularly explicit about it, and I wouldn't have had the confidence to speak out. So I would have, introduced the girls to things like considering the nature of places of worship. Why do people in, different faith communities perhaps build places of worship by rivers or on hilltops or whatever, and try and get them to think about these things. But I don't think I was challenging the curriculum in any way. I think I was a great concern to the Padre's wife.
How so?
Well, she clearly saw me as extremely heretical, and I did horrifying things like wearing an orange sari, which she took to be a sign of probably some sort of creeping Hindu allegiance. And there was a very elderly and almost totally deaf former member of staff who would be at the dining table every evening. And she saw me come in once with a bindi or a tilak, some mark on my forehead, because I think I'd been to the temple, and was absolutely horrified, I'm sure. But I'd come out in a different generation, a different time. I'd come out post-independent India. She'd gone deaf probably before independence. And so I had a completely different approach. I was wanting to discover what was going on around me and to be part of it.
And how was that received by the students? There are these students of various backgrounds. You mentioned that a substantial number, 50% or thereabouts, were Sikh. Were they enthusiastic about sharing their experiences and talking about their cultural orientation with you, who they might have sensed to be open-minded, if not a kindred spirit, or was it not quite like that?
I don't think they could very much, because some of them had been in boarding school from about the age of 4 or 5. So, for example, there was a school holiday, or at least the Sikh pupils were allowed to go down to the Gurdwara by the lake when it was Guru Nanak's birthday. So I offered to be one of the teachers who went down to escort them. We go down to the Gurdwara. I've been to one Gurdwara before. I'd been to a historic one in Delhi in my first week in India. Otherwise, I'd never been in a Sikh place of worship. And I hear a great cry go up of Jo bole sonihal sat sri akal, and I want to know what it means. So I ask my pupils, and either they don't know or they can't possibly explain, and it is pretty difficult to explain and translate anyway. And I realise that they haven't been educated in a way that enables them to articulate, probably even in, say, Punjabi or Hindi, but certainly not in English, that aspect of their lives. So they're living, as many students do, in a way that involves maybe a different home language from the language of school, and that's all the more accentuated if you're in a boarding school with a different medium and a different religion wrapping around you.
Yeah. I want to make a small diversion before I move on to Sikhism proper. The first concerns this word that I thought I naively had some sense as to how to pronounce, but now no longer do, after having heard one of your interviews and also heard you just now. So there is the Sikh place of worship, which is spelled in English, Gurdwara, but it sure doesn't sound like that because you have other syllables somehow in there. So how is one supposed to Gurdwara?
Well, I just say Gurdwara.
Gurdwara. That's still not good. But
I think when I'm speaking quickly, I probably say it differently if I'm not being self-conscious.
Oh, now I made you self-conscious.
I know I've had Sikhs come to me and say, you actually pronounce things you pronounce them the Punjabi way rather than the English way. But if I start thinking about it, then it's more difficult.
Okay, all right. So I won't have you go there and try to help me with that.
I'm not saying that I pronounce Punjabi properly. It's just that I don't pronounce Punjabi words in a completely English way. And I did have the interesting experience of being at a conference in Rome and finding myself with a bunch of Indian origin academics on a day out, and them saying in great puzzlement, why do you speak Hindi with a Punjabi accent? Which I took as a great compliment.
You also mentioned, and this is perhaps preempting or at least foreshadowing something I hope to get to later, but later on when you returned to England and you were teaching in a school, you were pronouncing the children's names in the correct way, to be pronouncing their names. And this was somewhat off-putting, not only to surrounding administrators and perhaps teachers, but also the children themselves, because they had been so used to having their names pronounced in the wrong way. So again, this gets back to what you were saying earlier about the obviously different children, a different school in a different land, but still one is conditioned by one's environment.
Life is such a process of learning and unlearning, so having really carefully trained myself to pronounce names more or less accurately in India. There I was in a comprehensive school in Coventry, having the Punjabi students embarrassed, very embarrassed, and others saying, "Oh, she's half-casteed," or "Are you going out with a Paki, miss?" So that didn't work well at all. And the names I'm thinking of, for example, I had one student who was presented to me in England as Onkar. And I said, your name's Onkar. Because I knew, ik Onkar, there is one reality, or one God is, however you want to translate it. Like almost every Sikh name at that time, though this is no longer the case, there was a profound religious meaning to the name, and turning it into Onkar just didn't work for me. And then there was another one who had the name Tirth, which means a place of pilgrimage. And because it's spelt Tirth, he was Tirth, to rhyme with Firth of Forth, birth, mirth. It's logical, isn't it? And children probably hadn't even heard their names pronounced in Punjabi, because in Indian homes it's very widespread for children to have a home name, a family name, not actually to be addressed by their registered name. So they would only hear it probably when they go to nursery or primary school. And then it's just however the first nursery school teacher or kindergarten teacher or whatever decides to pronounce that particular string of letters.
And then they get renamed throughout the rest of their academic
That's right.
career.
And of course, there isn't a one-to-one phonetic connection between characters of the Roman alphabet and English pronunciation. So Punjabi names are often, the same name will be transliterated in different ways. In school, you'd end up having an Amadip, and an Amadeep, but they're both Amardeep, but because one person's got it spelt IP and the other double EP, obviously in school, the teachers are going to pronounce them as two different names, and so it goes on. So I think I realised in the end that one has to compromise in the interests of the feelings of the person concerned. And there is the interesting situation in the UK anyway, where you now have parents who, from the point of view of the purist, mispronounce the name that they're giving their child. So I've got a neighbour called Ashok, but his parents will call him Ashok, because that's the way everybody hears it and says it. And I've got neighbours who told me that their child was called Dian, and I said, Dian? And then I thought, I had a pupil called Gian, which I realised was Gyan, which means knowledge. So probably Dian is Dhyan, which is a word for sort of attention and contemplation. So my neighbour, I really want to say hello Dhyan, but I don't think I can. I think I've got to say hello Dian.
You also talk about when you returned from India, the sense of culture shock. I've heard this from many people who had similar experiences of living in different places, that for many of them, they were prepared through stories or warnings or what have you of facing culture shock when they went away. Somebody I know who's a Chinese scholar had a very similar experience. But in fact, the real culture shock happened when he returned. And he felt that he had progressed and developed and changed considerably as a person, and nobody around him had. At least that was his perception of things. And you relate a similar sensation when you came back to England after having spent, I guess, 2.5 years, the better part of 3 years in India.
Yes, and I think what has to be borne in mind is that I was immersed in India. Okay, I was immersed in a rather peculiar boarding school, if you like, but I was immersed. I didn't hear my parents' voices for 2.5 years. Even though my father worked in a telephone exchange, it never occurred to either of us that we should actually speak by phone. Trunk calls from India were complicated, and sometimes payments were required for the call to mature, or whatever the word was. And what you did was write letters on blue airmail forms. And it didn't occur to any of us that I should come home in the holidays, like my students at Warwick University. They might come for the term and then they shoot off back to Delhi or Bombay or wherever they live, and then they come back for term again. Well, that wasn't the way I did India at all. So I had been well and truly saturated in India, not just the boarding school in the hills, but travelling pretty much the length and breadth in my three-month winter vacations. And then coming back to the UK, I think took about an equivalent length of time for me to readapt, in the sense that for probably the first 2 or 3 years I was back, almost everything I experienced, I'd be thinking, oh, in India, it would be like this, or they wouldn't say that in India, or in India, it would look like that. And it took about that length of time for that to stop being my first reaction to everything.
Were you discriminated against because of that? Did you face any negative sentiments voiced by various quarters?
It's an interesting question. I remember the education advisor, I think, who interviewed me for my job in Coventry and made some remark about the fact that I was wearing a sort of long tunic top over my trousers, which was, I think he perceived, the effect of being in India. And my flatmate in my first flat was absolutely disgusted because she found I was wanting to store Indian spices and cook Indian food and have Indian friends. And that was not what she bargained for, having, what she thought was going to be a reasonably normal English person sharing with her. And I do remember a school friend's mother reacting to my accent. I'd obviously gone a bit sort of Anglo-Indian in something that I said, and she said, oh, chi. And she clearly picked up that I'd got a different intonation from when I went. So, and then of course there were the comments I mentioned in school where pupils assumed that there must be a relationship with an Asian person or something. So yeah, those were interesting. I always found those very interesting because it's so difficult to identify with people who face real prejudice and discrimination, and just even the slightest trace of a negative reaction like that is helpful in understanding what other people go through routinely. So, for example, in India, when I remember my close colleague was going to get an apartment in Delhi and she was going to visit it, and her brother said to her sternly, "Don't take Eleanor with you." And I realised that I would be perceived as perhaps a hippie and it wouldn't be good for her when she was going to meet a new landlord or whoever was going to let the premises. That was a really useful experience because it was the closest I was going to have to the experience that my husband and others had when they came to Britain and they went for, say, to buy a house, and they'd be told, oh, sorry, it's sold, and they realised that, or they were told that the owner had said no blacks, no coloureds.
Have you always been this broad-minded? Were you that broad-minded in real time? When people were saying these things to you, don't take Eleanor, did you say to yourself, oh, this is a good experience, this will enable me to understand what it feels like to face persecution? Or were you angry like a normal person would have been?
Oh, well, I was a bit upset, but I was very quickly appreciative of it as an experience. And actually, going over to my husband's experience again, he says how when that happened to him, he immediately thought of the experience of untouchables in India and caste prejudice, which he'd never experienced as a person of higher caste, and how it was helpful to have that sort of experience and to understand, or he could understand in that way. So I don't think I'm unique in having that sort of a reaction.
Okay. Perhaps I'm particularly narrow-minded or quicker to anger or something.
If I'd had really harsh experiences, if I'd had real discrimination, like not being able to get a job or a house or something like that, it would have been different. These are just very, very microscopic experiences compared with what's routine for a lot of people.
Right, windows into their world, brief glimpses, I suppose.
I think more importantly was the experience in India of people reacting to me sometimes on the basis that, oh, she's white, she's Christian, she's meat-eating, she won't care about older people in her family. This sort of bundle of assumptions that were made about me, and also sometimes spelled out, oh, she's a hippie, or oh, she's a missionary, because that's what white people are.
How often did you find yourself subjected to those sorts of views?
I think I was aware of that sort of perception a number of times. Yeah. For example, I got the news that my mother was very ill, and I was staying with close Indian friends, and somebody made some remark like, but we didn't think that British people cared about their relatives. Or, yeah, there would be assumptions. British people put old people in homes. They don't look after them in their family like we do. Those sorts of things. We're talking about the 70s. Now, there are far more similarities in stretches of Indian society, similarities with, the pressures and experiences and strategies of lots of people in British society.
Mm. So let's talk to Sikhism, and let's talk a little bit in detail of the history and what it is and some of the tenets and so forth. And I'd like to move to some of the misconceptions about it as well at the end. But before I turn it over to you, I seem to remember from the very short introduction that I'm mispronouncing it, and everybody seems to be mispronouncing it, that it really should be Sikhism. Or is that not correct?
You see, this is all very interesting. In English, we normally say Sikh and Sikhism. The Punjabi word is Sikh.
Sikh.
So it's what we call a short I, but it's not like the English word sick, meaning ill. It ends in the sort of way that loch, a Scottish lake, ends. Okay, so I fluctuate. I move between saying Sikh and saying Sikh. What I'm really allergic to is Sikhism, but if you're asked to write a book and its title's given you, you can't do much about it. And isms really agitate me more than the sorts of things we've been talking about, because you're immediately into misapprehensions. India didn't have any things called isms until Europeans arrived, and terms like Hinduism, Buddhism, Sikhism, and so on were coined by Westerners to encompass, to mean what they perceived as religions, which they assumed in some way to be parallel to what they knew better, which was Christianity. So you have this pattern that's assumed, and it's been assumed for generations now, in the West at least, a pattern of a founder and a scripture and a calendar of festivals and an ethical code and so on and so on. As if you've got these very similar bundles. One's got the name Christianity, one's got the name Buddhism, but they're going to have comparable ingredients. They're going to have rites of passage, which of course are going to include something to do with birth, something to do with death, something to do with marriage, and something to do with initiation or coming of age. So you then get a very widespread assumption of, when people are asking about the Sikh tradition, that when people are initiated, when, as Sikhs would say, they take Amrit, that's somehow going to happen at about the age that somebody might be confirmed in the Anglican Church or might be having their bar mitzvah. Whereas it isn't like that. A Sikh is quite likely to say for many years, and maybe all their life, that they're not in a position to observe the discipline that's required if you take Amrit, if you become a member of the core community of Sikhs who have the outward uniform, if you like, and who follow a strict code. And so even somebody who is devout and very respectful of the tradition may decide never to take Amrit. Or it may be that parents say, look, a child can't possibly observe what's required of them. It's better that they do this, as an adult. And then, as an adult, if you break one of the rules, like willingly or unwillingly, some hair is removed from your body, you shave your beard or whatever, then it would be appropriate to take Amrit again, which isn't the way, generally speaking, people view, say, a bar mitzvah. So, and actually the scripture yes, okay, Sikhs have got a scripture, the Guru Granth Sahib. The word guru is a giveaway. The scripture is the living guru, the living spiritual teacher. And so behaviour around the scripture is different from what's expected in many Christian contexts, for example, around the book that is the Bible. And yet in another way, the language that's used to talk about the scripture is much more similar to the language that's used about the elements of Holy Communion in the Roman Catholic Church, for instance. Because for example, instead of talking about a page of the scripture, Sikhs may talk about an ang, a limb of the scripture, because this is the body of the Guru. You're much closer to the, this is my body language than you are to the words that are usually used for describing, say, a Bible or a Quran. So having these parallel isms very easily leads into a way of thinking that's equating things, paralleling phenomena and experiences, and blurring the distinctiveness of them, and blurring the concepts that underlie them. So yes, Sikhism, I would much rather be talking about Sikhs, as in the people, or if I've got to have a word for what's usually called Sikhism, I'll say Sikh religious tradition, or maybe the Sikh faith, but of course faith, tradition, religion, they all have different sets of connotations. So I'd probably vary them and often be talking about the Sikh community.
Did you have a fight with people at OUP?
Oh, no, because there's no way that this is the series. These are the titles, and it's not just OUP. It's happened over and over again that the writers have to fit into categories that they've not chosen.
Again, from the perspective of somebody who doesn't know anything about this, if I could force you, at the risk of trivializing, bearing in mind, very much as you've said, we should be very careful of false parallels. We should be loath to assume that the structure of the Sikh, am I saying that correctly?
And it's quite all right to say Sikh.
Persuasion. Well, I think if these people call themselves that, then we should, it's not that hard to say. One should make an effort to pronounce it in the way that people know. But
what's so interesting, of course, is that people then adopt the label that's being given by people around.
Well, they had no choice. I mean, at some level.
It's like Hindus saying that they're Hindu when actually that's not the word they would have used until
that's the wrong
the 19th
word too.
century.
Okay.
It's even more the wrong word.
Oh my goodness. So what is?
Well, I mean, the point about Hindu is it's a name that arises, a geographical term. It arises from the Sindhu, the Indus River, then being mispronounced by invaders from further west, people who are coming from further west into India. So everything that's east of the Indus River, certainly all the ways of life, are termed Hindu.
I see.
But it's a bit like talking about Europism.
I see. Well, at least it's better than calling Native North Americans Indians.
But Hindus are used to the word Hindu, so...
Right.
And talking about North America, Sikhs have been called Hindus were called Hindus for many decades in North America.
Well, North Americans are just generally confused. We all know that. So, from the perspective of somebody who knows nothing about this and says, oh, goodness, I'd like Eleanor to tell me something about the Sikh tradition and where it comes from, what the history is, when it started. By gosh, I'm going to run right out and read this horribly titled but fascinating and provocative, very short introduction. Yeah. But in advance of that, I'd like to know a little bit about these people and broadly speaking, what some of the core beliefs and orientations are.
I very often start by talking about Punjab, because almost 100% of Sikhs are of Punjabi background, and to understand the emergence of the Sikh tradition, I think one has to have that geographical fact in place somewhere. And Sikhs arose, if you like, with the birth or with the life of Guru Nanak, who was born in 1469. So we're talking about a religious movement that's roughly contemporary with Protestantism in Europe. And like that, it is in some ways a protest, or at least a commentary on the social and religious framework in which Guru Nanak lived. And that environment was one of people who we now call Hindu and people who we would call Muslim. So what Guru Nanak is doing is very much expressing the truth as it comes to him. He's believed to have had a profound experience as a young man, which is recorded in the traditions, the stories of his life. So he's expressing this call to a true religion, a religion of the heart, a religion that's free of the trappings of empty ritual. And he can only use the language of Punjab, of Islamic and Indic culture. So what he does is actually not just write poems, but sing songs. And these songs, this Bani, his utterance, is full of imagery from Hindu and Muslim and Punjabi life. And his emphasis is very, very much on the fact that life needs to be based around the Naam, the sort of essence, essential divinity, the name of God, literally Naam. And it's going to involve a balance between seva, which is voluntary service of others, and simran, which is this spiritual mindfulness. And it seems pretty clear from Guru Nanak's compositions that hereditary status, what we often call the caste system, is certainly irrelevant as far as spiritual progress is concerned. Sikhs have developed this into saying that the gurus overthrew caste and so on. Certainly, caste, status, birthright had no place in terms of the spiritual life. And Guru Nanak not only went about communicating through his poetry and spreading his message, but he also settled in a place called Kartarpur and created a community which almost certainly followed a pattern of manual work and daily devotion. And his hymns, his Bani, his utterance, became the basis of what was to be the Guru Granth Sahib, the Sikh scripture, which eventually came to consist of the words of 6 of the Gurus, so Guru Nanak himself and 5 of his successors, as well as the words of other inspired poets from North India. So with Guru Nanak, you not only have these insights about the nature of God or of reality as fundamentally one, Ek Onkar is often attributed to Guru Nanak, the oneness of being. You not only have this person with these spiritual insights, but you have the starts of the institutionalization. He appoints a successor. So there's a place with a Sikh community, Sikh meaning a follower, a disciple. There's a successor in place who is not one of his 2 sons, but somebody who he appoints because of his devotion. And so I think this is the greatness of Guru Nanak. There had been other poets who were critical of the social system and who sang about oneness with God, being Kabir, for example. But somehow a distinct, or what came to be a distinct religious community didn't develop on the basis of their inspiration in the way that happened with Guru Nanak and then his successor gurus.
Two things stand out. One is, as I understand it, notwithstanding the orientation to focus on spiritual matters, to live a righteous life and so forth, there was quite a strong anti-ascetic sense, if I understand correctly.
Yes.
There's this notion that it's not a good idea to just withdraw from the world and commit oneself to studying spiritual matters, that's part and parcel of the spiritual side, or studying and developing oneself in that way is part and parcel of a complete integrated lifestyle, which should also incorporate living very much in the world.
Well, often people will talk about the Hindu tradition in terms of not just the classes of society, from those who are doing the most menial or manual work through to those who are in the role of teacher and spiritual guide, but also stages of life. The student stage and the householder stage, and then gradually withdrawing from responsibility and becoming somebody who's spiritually focused completely. In contrast to that, it's often explained that the Sikh way is to, as it were, encompass all of those activities and all of those stages of life together, and rather than perhaps heading towards asceticism at some later stage even, the emphasis is on being in the family, carrying family responsibilities. It's expected that people marry, it's expected that they have children. And so the emphasis is on grihast, on the married householder life. And another emphasis is on earning your living through honest labour, and then sharing what you earn with others. Great emphasis on giving, perhaps best expressed in the langar, the institution of providing free hospitality, free vegetarian food in Sikh places of worship, so that anybody who comes, provided they aren't carrying tobacco or drunk, anybody who comes is welcome to partake. And Sikhs are rightly, I think, proud of this tradition of seva, of voluntary service. And it's not just grounded in the gurus and going back to the beginnings of the faith, but it's constantly finding new expression, for example, now in what's seen as an age of austerity, with people needing food banks and so on. It's not that Sikhism has somehow discovered a new way of being. It's a continuation of something that's solidly there in the centre of the tradition, the involvement in the family, the involvement in society. And it's the balance which one of the gurus referred to, I suppose, as miri piri, the temporal and the spiritual. And I've said the word balance several times. It's not a word that particularly translates a concept in the Sikh tradition, but it's a word which one of my co-authors and friends, Gopinder Kaur, I think introduced me to the fine balance, which is what Sikhism, the Sikh tradition, is about, this balance between the spiritual and the physical, the inward-looking and the outward-looking. It's the life of the Gurmukh, to use a central Sikh term. The Gurmukh is the person who is facing Mukh, the Guru, Gurmukh, as opposed to the opposite of that, which is what we mostly are, the Manmukh, who is the person who is focused on his or her own whims and wants.
So it's this notion of ego or egocentricity to some extent.
Yeah, Sikhs have this word holme, which it sort of means I, me, ego, and yeah, holme is definitely to be constrained and avoided, along with anger and covetousness and a number of other human characteristics which are felt to lead people away from the Guru and away from God.
How much was made of this idea that, as you've mentioned, that Guru Nanak did not appoint one of his sons as a guru and deliberately took someone else? It seems to me that's a very strong statement, especially when you're starting something. Yes. There are, of course, obvious historical precedents for good government or good structure that involve looking beyond one's own kin. One can, as a classicist, obviously, one can look at several of the more generally considered successful Roman emperors who appointed people outside of their own families as successors. Was this something that in the Sikh tradition is underscored, that people recognize that this was a deliberate act of looking for the most pious, for the most knowledgeable, or was this just incidental?
No, it's very much mentioned by Sikhs and in writing about the Sikh tradition, not least because one of Guru Nanak's sons was extremely pious. In fact, he was an ascetic, Sri Chand, and there are still people who follow his tradition. So it's very clear, or it seems to be clear, that Guru Nanak is saying, no, I don't intend my followers to be ascetics, as you say, not to be following in the way of this son of mine, but to be going the way of the person, Guru Angad Lehna, who he appointed as his successor. But later on, it is the case that the later gurus were all of one family, the Sodhi family. It wasn't straightforwardly father-son in succession like that, but they were all members of that family. And certainly Sikhs would say, well, there isn't a problem with that. The most suitable person may be a blood relative, but it's not being a blood relative that is the chief criterion. But historically, not surprisingly, recurrently there has been competition and disagreement over who the next guru should be.
And then there were, as I understand it, there were 10 gurus that led to the last guru who ended sometime in the very early part of the 18th century.
So 1708 was when Guru Gobind Singh died. The Sikhs don't like to use such a final word as died, okay. But it's difficult in English to use idioms like light merging with light and to actually use the respectful language that's required. But yeah, certainly the 10th Guru's earthly life ended in 1708. It could also be questioned whether he was the last of the Gurus, because Guru Gobind Singh established the fact that following him there wouldn't be a human Guru, but there would be the Guru Panth and the Guru Granth. That means the Sikh community and the Sikh scripture. And in practice, it's the Guru Granth Sahib, the scripture, which is especially regarded as the continuing, living Guru. I think in this book I say how in English we have the word guide, which can either be a person or a book. And similarly, we can think of Guru in that way. But in this case, with the Guru book being in many ways treated as the living Guru, often having a separate room to be put to bed in at night for example, to repose at night in the Gurdwara rather than staying, as it were, on display in the room, the big hall in which devotees gather in the daytime. And there will be various other details of care for the Guru Granth Sahib which mirror the way in which a guru would have been treated, and that in turn mirrored the way in which a Mughal emperor or a local king would have been treated. So the Guru Granth Sahib is to be beneath a canopy, to be fanned with a particular achori, which has come to be a symbol of respect for the Guru Granth Sahib and of authority, and is a reminder of how in the days before electric fans and air conditioning and so on, an emperor and then a Sikh guru, a spiritual personality of great eminence, would have an attendant fanning them. So we have this continuity from the first guru right the way through the 9 successor human gurus and into the Guru Granth Sahib.
You give this anecdote, and I don't know how typical this is, but of a request for flying 150 or more, I don't remember the exact number, but anyway, lots of copies of the Guru Granth Sahib to Vancouver, and they each had to be sitting by themselves on occupying a seat, and then there was some ritual whereby they were taken off the plane by various people, I think barefoot in Vancouver, which is perhaps better than being barefoot in Edmonton or something like that, given the time of year. But again, a clear example of this notion of not just using the words, but regarding this work as a living guru.
Yes, and something which has developed quite strongly of recent years and which has been documented by my colleague in Sweden, Christina Myrvold, is the way in which when a Guru Granth Sahib can no longer be enthroned in worship because the pages have got worn and so on, it's no longer a physically perfect volume, it will actually have a formal cremation ceremony in a particular place in Punjab, and the conventions for this have sort of been elaborated. So the guru, in fact, is cremated as a human might be. So that's another example of that. And also, it's a reason why most devout Sikhs, when I was doing my research, say in the 80s and 90s, they wouldn't have the Guru Granth Sahib at home. Their not having the scripture at home didn't mean that they weren't devout. It meant that they didn't have a room in their house where they could, which they could devote to such an important guest. Now there's a strange situation, of course, where everybody has got the Guru Granth Sahib on their mobile phone and on their laptop, and I wonder what the implications are.
For most people who don't know very much about the Sikhs, I think one thing they might have heard of or they might know is they might associate a Sikh with a turban, they might associate a Sikh with a sword, and there, certainly in the public consciousness, there have been various court cases about individuals of a Sikh faith wanting to ensure that they could continue